It's always a pleasure to be at one of these events. Um, as Adam said, I'm an economist, and happiness is one of these topics that is of interest outside of economics, though it's actually been neglected perhaps for the last 50 years by psychologists, by philosophers, by sociologists, by all the sort of people who might. But there's been quite an upsurge of interest. So, as I say, I'm an economist, and I come at this from an economist perspective. And one of the things that is perhaps me worth saying is I think these happiness measures, which we've all become very interested in, are very useful, but I'm also quite ambivalent about it. So my attitude is I'm not going to try to sell you these as the solution to everything. So I've just a couple of maybe 6 or 8 very quick bullet points here. One is that happiness or life evaluation, which is a little bit different, measures are responsive to much more than just money. So if you have more money, you tend to say you're better off on these scales, but they're responsive to other things. Now, that's a very good thing for economists, because economists are sort of obsessed with money. Right? All they care about is money, and they think you're better off if you have more money. And if you don't have less money, you're fine. And, that doesn't do a very good job for a lot of things. And happiness is sensitive to changes in people's lives that are not just to do with money, like marriage, for instance, divorce. But even in the economics domain, they're very sensitive to unemployment. And that's been a really important finding of this literature, because it suggests that if people lose their job, you give them money to make up. That's not enough. They don't like it still. And happiness picks that up. And that's a really good thing for the happiness measures. The other thing from an economist perspective, and I suspect none of you are actually economists, but if you've seen what economists do, they build models with something called utility in it all the time. And that has no content by and large. It's just a mathematical trick for getting on to the next stage. And wouldn't it be nice if we had something to actually put in that box? And maybe these measures, asking people, how their lives are going, is a useful thing there. So that. The other thing is, for someone practical like me, who has spent a lot of their life collecting data once or another, these are really easy questions to ask. You try asking someone what their income is, right? And you're going to spend the next hour explaining to them what income is and what the different parts of income are. And you'll get a mess in the end, which you don't understand anyway. But we do it all the time. If you ask people how happy you are on a scale of 1 to 10, boy, you get an answer almost immediately, and you go on to the next question. So you get a lot of information for really very little. The last positive thing, I'm sure there are more, but these are the ones I first thought of, is they sort of directly address mental health issues. And mental health is something that's been ignored maybe too much. And so if one of the things they might mean is just, how is your mental health? Okay, so let me finish with a quick points of disagreement. All right. So some people think that happiness is all that matters. And, everything else should be judged by how happy it makes you. And what's more, a second step, that happiness is well enough measured by asking people on a scale of 0 to 10 how well you are. I think that's absurd. But there are serious people who think that's what you ought to do. And nothing. If there's a thing that makes you happy, then it's a good thing. If it doesn't make you happy, it doesn't matter. So that's the attitude that I don't agree with here. Now, one of the reasons for not believing in that is something that really comes very clearly from the writings of Amartya Sen. And that is that people sometimes can use happiness as an adaptation strategy. So even if people are being really abused and are seriously deprived, they might say they're happy, or they might actually be happy because they think that's the best they can do with their lives. So this is very much into the sort of oppression of women, for instance, in societies where women don't have full rights. Women might adapt that social standard to the point they say, yes, I'm very happy. but there's lots of things I'm not allowed to do. And that, to some, is, just because people are happy with it doesn't mean that we shouldn't have to do something about it. So, and that I think is one of the biggest criticisms of the happiness literature. There are also some pretty odd findings, and the question is what do you do with those? So, I've done some work in the US that shows that Black people in the US are pretty much as happy, sometimes much happier than white people. I just don't believe that, or if I do believe it, I don't think it means we don't have to worry about the standing of Black people versus white people in the US. So that's an example of the SEN type thing. And that means that even if we collect happiness data, we really need to know about these other things too, about material deprivation and what's happening to people. So that's my little blurb. I think it's been interesting enough for me to, get involved in it. And I'm very curious to hear your questions, what you think about this, and to try and give some short answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that beautiful encapsulation of so much. And there's so much to respond to there, and I'm sure that people will be responding to those points as they raise their own points. As I say, no particular order to this. Let's start with Claude from the Philippines, please. Oh, please do say your name and where you're from when you start.
Sure. Hi, good evening, everyone, or good morning to others. I'm Claude. I'm from the Philippines. Hello, Professor Deaton. It's really nice meeting you here. And one question that I have in mind, because I am a student of urban and regional planning, and it's actually the irony that I've seen in terms of the developed countries wherein they have all the support, as you mentioned, they have the money, they have infrastructure, support system. However, there's like a rise in their suicide rates. So I think it's a good indicator of us as well of happiness, because we look into the wellness of the people. And say, for example, a country that I visited is Korea, which is according to World Health Organization has like they're fourth in most number of suicides in their country. What, so there's like an irony compared to, for example, in my country, in the Philippines, we're not that, we're part of the developing countries, and we're actually subjected to the challenges of climate change, where there's a lot of typhoons happening. There's a lot of challenges, and we don't have that support coming from the government, like for those infrastructure and social welfare programs. However, people here seems to have that, we call it Filipino resilience. And despite facing those disasters and typhoons, we get to see people smiling, adapting to the challenges in life, which also Professor Deaton has mentioned, one indicator of happiness as well. So as an urban planning student, how do we develop our cities, the future that we want, ensuring that there's that happiness and well-being of the people living in the communities that we have? I think that's the question that I have when I joined this.
That's a great question, Claude. Okay. I think I could spend the rest of the hour and a half talking about some of those things. Suicide is very, very complicated thing, and it's not very well understood, is one of the things. When I first started getting interested in this, I'd been interested in suicide. And there are two leading researchers of happiness, Blanchflower and Oswald, and I wrote to each of them separately and said, is it true that happier countries have lower suicide rates or higher suicide rates? Right? And they each wrote back to me and said, we know that. It's obvious. Here's the answer. And they both gave completely opposite answers. One said happy countries have high suicide rates, and the other said happy countries don't. In the US, Ann Case and I spent some time looking at this, and there's almost no correlation. And across the world, there's not that very much correlation either. It's not, I think, true that rich countries have higher suicide rates. And I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I know that China was a place that had enormously high suicide rates, particularly among women, for a very long time. And that seems to have diminished, largely because of all the things that have gone on in China. A lot of those suicides used to be with fertilizer in rural areas. That's not so available anymore. And women are treated better, and that helps. I'm not sure in your case I would use happiness as the guide, and I'm not sure I would use suicide either. Suicide can be something, well, I'm not sure I want to say that. The US is one of the few countries where suicide rates have been rising over the last 20 years. And Case and I made that a sort of centerpiece of the work we've been doing. So we think that indicates something very bad going on. But, there are other places, historically, Sweden, where Adam comes from, and where they're very nice people, had very high suicide rates. I don't think that's true anymore. So it's very puzzling, and I wouldn't put too much weight on it. And I think, the Sen approach when you're doing your urban planning is likely to be more productive than relying on indicators like suicide or happiness.
Thank you so much. I totally agree. It's really a puzzling and very complex issue right now, which is, I think, the good thing is it's being talked about. And as Professor Deaton also mentioned earlier, it was also mentioned about the well-being. It's really an issue that we really have to talk about. And I think that's a good start, despite the puzzle and mysteries behind it. Yeah.
I just wanted to invite, if there's anybody else who just wants to jump in on this topic, feel free, or we'll move on. But if you wave your hand at me, if you really want to jump in. Yes, please, Ethan.
I'd love to jump in because Professor Deaton, I'm a big fan of one of the works that you've done, and that was that particular study you did with, was it white Americans, rising mortality rates in white Americans as compared to the rest of the world in the 2010? Yeah, I was correct. Correct me if I'm wrong, right? And in that particular study, you looked at how the rising incidences of suicide as well as liver disease in these particular individuals, especially those from lower income brackets. Now, my question is, we understand that America is generally a country where most people are well-to-do. If a consumer wants to get the goods for basic survival, food, water, shelter, they are generally able to do so. So my question is, are these increases in mortality with our lower income brackets due to social determinants, or is it, traditional lack of ability to consume, as the traditional economists would say?
No, yes, no, yes. I could do a bit better than that, though. So let me start with a correction, which is actually important. It's not low income brackets, it's low education brackets. And it's true, while people who have less education have less money, they're not the same thing by any manner of means. And actually, a very predominant, when we first started working on this, the death rates among African Americans from these things were very low. They've gone up subsequently. And poor people in America, there's a very large fraction of them are African Americans. So, and also when you look at what's happened over time with incomes, these deaths are not correlated with that. What they are correlated with is education. And so that takes us to the point you made at the end, which I think is dead right, which is this is a social phenomenon. And what is happening in America is that, we've created this social structure in which people with a 4-year college degree, the 30% of the population that has that, are treated as sort of high status people, and everybody else is not. And so, in jobs, in societies, in church, in lots of things. So there is this sort of unfolding catastrophe in America for people without the BA degree. Now, whether it's a good idea to give everybody a BA is a different question. But I think the answer to your question is it's primarily a socioeconomic question, and that the way our economy is structured too is that the BA is necessary to get dignity and a good life. Actually, in response to our book, we saw something the other day from CEO of one of America's largest companies, and their standard practice has been to hire people only with a BA, and they're going to stop that in response to our work. And because they don't really care about it, it's just an efficient screen. They get thousands of applicants, so let's get rid of the ones that don't have a BA. And they're realizing they're missing really good people that way. So thank you.
Angus, is that just let me do a follow on? Is that model of educational attainment leading to sort of social acceptance being exported around the world? I mean, it's happening everywhere, isn't it? That basically people's livelihoods in the future are linked, and perhaps their happiness are linked to their grade attainment at school, which is a worrying trend.
Yeah, that's true. And, some of it's not worrying. You'd actually like people who are competent to do jobs that we need competent people for. You don't want someone who doesn't know how to fly an airplane to fly your airplane, right? So we need people to be trained for the jobs. What seems to be happening here, and it is true that around the world, as technology changes, education seems more and more important in the workplace. But that doesn't mean these arbitrary cutoffs around a BA are a good idea. And, there are countries like Germany, for instance, that are much better at training people for apprenticeships. And so the idea is to break the link between social standing and an arbitrary education degree. And here, this 4-year BA. And, other countries manage to do that quite well. And I think we're doing it much more than we need to.
Thank you. Okay, again, no particular order to this, but let's go to Maha next, please.
Thank you so much. I am Maha, a junior doctor from Pakistan. Pakistan, a country that is 6th most dangerous for women to live in, and also from the land of Malala, who stood up against the norms, fought with such bravery for the rights of women and girls. I am from a country where 32% women experience physical violence, from being deprived of basic rights, as what you said, education you were talking about, to denial of resources, opportunities, physical and emotional abuse, to murder, abduction, kidnapping, rape, gang rape, honor killings, and domestic abuse. It is somehow linked to awareness, definitely with the education that you were mentioning before, and poverty. My question to Mr. Deaton is, how is it linked with economy, or how gender-based violence affects economy?
After that catalog of horrors, it's taking me a moment to think about how to connect that up. I don't know is the answer. And also, let me deny the premise again a little bit. These horrors are horrors, and how they relate to the economy is not necessarily the first question that I would sort of ask, So I'm sure you didn't mean to say this, but you don't want to, no one would argue that if they don't hurt the economy, then they're okay. That's clearly not true at all. My guess is that, like many rebellions in history, that what is happening here is partly in response to positive things that are happening. So traditional cultures in which women had no role get very upset when there's the possibility, when there's signs of improvements of situation for women. And I don't know whether you would agree, but I mean, I think some of that is what is happening in India. And, it certainly happened in the United States when, there was, and people started doing something about civil rights in the states of Black people. And that was when lynching and so on got much worse. And, maybe it's a phase that has to be tolerated. Well, it's not tolerated. You have to try and stamp it out on the way to a better future. I just don't know. But I mean, again, I think your cases illustrate very well. If you asked some of these people who are being oppressed, whether they were happy or not. That's not the right way to go about it either.
So,
I would like to rephrase it. With my country, where people do not have right to education, and where women have not opportunity to get into the jobs, they're not giving equal opportunities as a whole of lack of opportunities with their participation, where economy is equal, balance, where men and women participate, and the most competitor and the best one comes out of it, to my least knowledge of economy. How would it impact? Because what my question was, in the pursuit of happiness, where there is an equitable world where everyone is getting their equal rights and basic education, that is one of them. If they're deprived of it, how does it impact the economy? Because when the most competitive of the people are deprived of the basic rights, they do not participate in it. That means in the developing country like mine, there would be we would still remain in that state when the opportunity is not given. So if I'm able to rephrase my question, sir.
I think there is a very strong economic rationale. And, it's clear that depriving people of their ability to flourish not only hurts them, but hurts the society in which they live. We know that. It doesn't necessarily stop it happening, though. And also, the phrase pursuit of happiness is one that I worry about a little bit, because it comes from the 18th century. It's part of the American, what is it? It's the Declaration of Independence, I guess. And, there were no women in the group that was making these things. There certainly weren't any Black people, and one of the things, I was born in Scotland. I'm a, not originally an American. I'm an American citizen now. And one of the things that I find astonishing about America, that it's tied to this 18th century absurd constitution, which is causing it to tie itself in knots. So I don't think the pursuit of happiness, I think in the founders just meant leave us alone, so we can get on with what we want to do ourselves. And I'm not sure that's a very great guide for anyone. Yeah.
I was thinking about that phrase as Maha was cataloguing at the beginning of her statement, the abuses, and as you referred, as you said, it's the complete mismatch between those actions and the idea of happiness. So maybe happiness isn't what this session should be called at all. What do you prefer do you have a word you prefer? Well-being, contentment, what is it?
Are you asking me or Maha?
Yeah, well, anyone, but let's start with you, Angus, and then anyone else can come up with a word. It'd be nice.
Well, Danny Kahneman and I did this work in which it turns out that we find there was difference between happiness on the one hand, which is, your immediate affect. Are you happy now? Right? And well-being, which is a more considered evaluation of the state of your life, right? So I'm much more interested in the latter than the former, but the former is obviously important. Or the former than the latter, but the happiness is like, are you happy now? You're having a good time, and they can be very different. One example is you might be at the funeral of a favorite uncle who died at the age of 95 or something, and you could be celebrating that person's life, and you would be very sad. On the other hand, if someone said, how is your life going? You say, well, it's going fine. That's what life is about, sort of idea. So those things can be very different. And I think for most of the purposes, the Senian type purposes of what makes your life worth living, we should be talking about that deeper, longer term concept about how is your life going. The emotions, the day-to-day emotions like sadness, anger, what psychologists call affect, are important too. And, that might often have quite a lot to do with suicide. But, I'm always accused when I get asked questions like this of giving the same answer, which is, I'm sorry, but it's complicated. Well, sometimes it just is.
Thank you. Well, anybody can throw in another good word along the way if they feel like it. Emma, should we come to you now?
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, wherever you are. I'm Emma. I'm a psychology major from Singapore. So it's a great honor to be here and nice to meet you, Professor Deaton. So from your works, Professor Deaton, I've read that emotional well-being is primarily social, right? So as someone who is quite in tune with my emotions, I noticed that sometimes my sources of stress or like emotional unwellness also comes from my social interactions with others. For instance, like unpleasant interactions or people who are mean, etc., etc. Right. So I've also noticed this amongst my peers that social interactions is both something they love and hate at the same time. Right. So I was just wondering, from an economist perspective, if there is any way to quantify social interactions so that there is an optimal amount we could adhere to in order to maximize our happiness.
It's a great question. You could make a lot of money marketing that if you find the answer to that question. I think it's very different for different people, actually. So I'm not sure, that optimizing it in some general way would be very useful. And it's interesting because my wife and I are always at odds about this. I love to see people and spend time with people and being out. And I'll say things like, we never see people. And she said, what do you mean? We had Joe around last night, you want to see him every night? And I think even people who are as close to one another as my wife and I are, have very different feelings about these things, and we have different needs, and it's to do with how we're brought up. But it's certainly true that a lot of having a satisfactory emotional life is to do with other people, right? I mean, it's to do with spending time with other people. It's to do with having good friends. It's to do with Danny Kahneman always tells me that people are very happiest when they're spending time with friends. And, I find that sort of plausible. It's not something economists have thought about very much, except that once again, in the work that Anne Case and I did on deaths of despair, one of the things that's sort of distressing is that the number of people who report in the surveys that they're having difficulty socializing with other people has been going up over time in the United States. And again, it's our friends who don't have a bachelor's degree. The more educated people are not seeing this decline. That doesn't mean they're ideal or they're at the right level or all the rest of it. But I think that's a real deprivation for people. And I think it's something that is something really to worry about. So again, except for the point that like everything is related to the economy, I'm not sure. But I think that the how I would see this in terms of what's going on in the economy is that as jobs go away, good jobs go away for people without a bachelor's degree, the societies around them are crumbling too. So that, not only are there no jobs in this town anymore, there's not much of a social life because, people don't have money and a lot of them have gone away. People are not going to church as much because there aren't so many of them. The local social institutions that make for social capital are weakening too. The unions, which used to be very important in manufacturing towns, have sort of vanished. They're really not there anymore. And so the natural pillars by which people socialize with each other have sort of gone away. I mean, a lot of people make friends at work. For instance, they don't work anymore. Or they go out for, they go out for a beer or whatever with their friends after work. Or, the other factories are supplying the people in the church and all that. So I think this decline that we're seeing in social life is certainly, very unpleasant and very difficult. And I don't know what to do about it. I mean, it's, we're not going to make all these jobs come back. And, in the past, there's been this sort of churning and this change. and somehow we've lived with it, and people have moved on and found good lives somewhere else. That doesn't seem to be happening to the same extent now. So that's what I worry about a lot.
I'm interested in Emma, in when Emma was talking about social interactions, did you have in mind face-to-face contact or digital interaction, or a mixture of the two? We have, as you know, during the afternoon on next Tuesday at the meeting, we have a session on digital well-being as well, and this is obviously an overlap point. But Emma, what interactions did you have in mind?
I guess it was mainly face-to-face interactions, but having brought up digital interactions, I find that it could be quite a cause for concern as well, because like in Singapore, cyberbullying is quite common in the schools. Yeah, so I guess both digital and face-to-face interactions can be discussed in this context. Yeah.
There are obviously a lot of issues associated with digital communication that go beyond this, but yeah.
Actually, I hello again.
Hi.
Sorry for interrupting. I realized I didn't introduce myself appropriately. My name is Ethan. I'm a fourth-year medical student from Singapore. And as we were talking about social interactions, one question that I have for you, Professor Deaton, as I know you've collected a whole bunch of data on this topic, is it just unilateral interactions, you and I, or does it have a wider connotation, say my place of belonging in a society or a workplace or to a culture?
Well, my first reaction is both, and those are very closely connected with one another. So that, you need friends, you also need a best friend. And if you don't have very many friends, it's going to be difficult to have a best friend. And so I think, what we're seeing here, and again, this is an incidental part of my study, not the central part of it, is a decline in both of these, much to people's harm.
Okay, well, please feel free to jump in whenever you want to. Just wave your hand at me. But otherwise, I'm just going to go to Rashmika, please.
Hello, I'm Rashmika. I'm currently studying biomedical science. It's my final year. So today I would like to talk about is success parallel with happiness? If it is, then why would those we perceive as huge superstars reach living the lives that we want to live, the ones we see are most commonly committing suicide? I believe these people are the ones that commit suicide because of the stigma attached to seeking help, because they are famous superstars. So like, how can they, get down to our level and seek help from somebody professional? So what can we do as professionals so that these people who have thoughts of suicide think twice and thrice to seek help before taking their own lives? Yeah, thank you.
Gosh, I've studied suicide in the large, much less suicide on the individual level. So, and I know it's hard, so that when we talk to the people, we do spend a lot of time thinking about preventing suicide. They're interested in what we do, but it seems like a secondary sort of thing. One of the things that may be relevant is Anne and I spend a month in Montana every summer. And Montana's one of the more remote places in the United States. It's a very large state and has almost no people in it. And we spend the rest of the time here in Princeton, in Mercer County, New Jersey. And I think the suicide rate in Madison County, Montana, is 3 to 5 times higher than the suicide rate here in Mercer County, New Jersey. And so that suggests sort of something that's linked with what you're saying, is just having the resources around. There's no people there. So everybody gets to feeling really bad from time to time. But if you have human contact, if you see people, if you have people to talk to, that's really going to help. Now, that said, I'm not sure I caught everything you said, especially at the beginning. Sometimes the sound is better than others. I don't know whether you want to come back or Adam can translate if I missed something.
I think it was the question was referring to people who are sort of living a life, a fast life of success, and can't necessarily get down to the level of the everyday where people can reach out to help them. Right. And so, which is something perhaps you'd like to comment on. But I was very struck by when you all wrote applications to be part of this. It was quite striking that suicide came up in a number of them. Quite a lot of the young people in front of us have had experiences of friends or acquaintances thinking about or even committing suicide, and that was awfully worrying. That it's so sort of prevalent. It's touching so many people. And I don't know. It's an awfully difficult subject. But if anybody else wanted to speak about it, please feel free.
It's certainly something that's not unknown in top American universities, where I'm not sure these kids, well, they are. I mean, flying high is maybe not quite the word I would use, but they're being incredibly successful, and they've been pushed very hard, and they've been very successful, and that may predispose people.
Well, that was also at the root of Rashmika's point, and please come back, Rashmika, if you like. But Claude, you raised your hand. Please, do you want to?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's like it's a valid reference, but I think with the pandemic that has happened, it's a new season that we have all faced, and there's really like that we were talking about social connections earlier. So during pandemic, all of those connections has been cut down, or maybe like has been lessened. So I think that may be one reason as well that why the young people are also quite concerned about the suicide rates and mental health awareness. And on my perspective as an aspiring urban planner, I'm quite curious, how should we work around this issue so that we would avoid that in the future that we want, so that we ensure that there's resilience and the social well-being, the well-being of the people that we are planning for is taken care of. We give support to them. So yeah, that's my insight on that area.
Anne and I had a big fight with Donald Trump over that issue. Actually, not personally with Donald Trump, but with his economic advisors and his health secretary, and we had sort of warring editorials in the Washington Post over that issue. So one of the speeches Donald Trump made was, he said, if you have lockdowns during the pandemic, thousands and thousands of people are going to kill themselves. And so the lockdown is worse than not having lockdown. If you don't have lockdown, people are going to die of COVID. If you have lockdown, people are going to die of suicides, and so you shouldn't have a lockdown. We wrote and said we didn't think that would happen, and it turned out we were right. So one of the things that is interesting, and again, it just is another way of explaining just how hard the suicide issue is, that in a lot of countries around the world, and I haven't checked in the last few months, but when, in the first year of the pandemic, suicide rates fell during the pandemic. I don't think anyone knows what that is. We haven't had a pandemic for a long time, not one like this. But one of the things that's true in the literature is that wartime tends to reduce suicide rates. And I think what happens is that people, when there's an external threat or an outside enemy, it turns people's minds away from their own problems towards collective problems. And that has issues of its own, but it's issues that suicide is not one of them. So that it tends to produce that feeling of some sort of solidarity, which is the opposite of what people feel when they're thinking about suicide. For those of you who are interested in suicide, you should go back and read Durkheim. I mean, Durkheim was the founder of sociology. He wrote his book at the end of the 19th century. He made all sorts of predictions, nearly all of which still hold. And one of the things that's relevant, you're all young, educated, very successful kids who had a hard time getting on this thing. So you've been very highly selected for your skills. And according to Durkheim, those were the people at risk, right? Or were one of the sets of people at risk. And the reason is that by being very successful academically, many of you have left behind the environments in which you grew up. And that's necessary for you to succeed in many countries. You know, you have to get scholarships, you have to leave your village, you have to leave your town. I remember when I went to Cambridge, when I was, you know, first year student, just being incredibly lonely and realizing that my parents had no idea what was happening to me. You know, I would talk to them on the phone and try to explain to them why I was unhappy. And they just, you know, they had no reference to think about the life I was leading. And that's what Durkheim said. So he said that suicides would be more prevalent among very educated people. And, you know, one of the things that Anna and I find in our work in the US is that the suicides have now become more prevalent among less educated people because of the reasons that we've been talking about. And that is a very unusual thing. In fact, the head of the suicide agency of the US government, we went to present our work. And when we put that graph up, he said, I've never seen anything like this in my life before. I'm just astonished. That has never happened before. This is not something that's supposed to happen. But I think for many people, and I think it goes back to, you know, what Rashmika was saying earlier too, is that, you know, among apparently very successful people, there is this Durkheimian mechanism still at work that you can only be very successful by shedding some of the support for some people that you grew up with. And so, you know, my Scottish village had no understanding of what it was like to be an undergraduate in Cambridge in 1967. You know, that was at a time when only 3 or 4% of the population was going to university. No one in my family had ever been to university before. And so, you know, I had a very sharp understanding of what that was like.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, next let's go to Rainbow.
Thank you so much. Hi, Professor Deaton. Sorry, it is like midnight for me now. So good morning, good afternoon. So actually, when I come across your papers, I actually have a question. So given that you've done a lot of research, so would you say that you've come across a formula or sort of like a formula that correlates happiness with something else? Like, or would you say that there would be like a final formula that can bring happiness to a person?
You could make a lot out of that too. I think it's going to be dependent on where you live and what you're doing, and it may be different in different societies. The paper that Danny Kahneman and I wrote got a lot of publicity because we said you don't get any happier after you got $75,000. Beyond that, extra money doesn't really do anything for your happiness. There was one CEO of a payments company in Seattle who read that paper and immediately paid all of his employees $75,000 a year and got a lot of publicity for that. I read in the paper the other day, he's now being arrested for sexual harassment and various other things. So maybe that story didn't have a happy ending. But to be more serious about it, I mean, that work and a lot of the other work has said, you know, money is important for happiness, but other things may be more important, you know, like having a satisfactory social life, like happy marriage, relationships with other people are likely to be really, really important. So I think maybe that's the big message, and maybe just a message for economists. You know, everybody else knew that already. Just economists who came along and said, hey, you know, it's only money that matters. And we're saying, well, there's a lot of evidence that's not really the case. There are happy towns, for instance. I've looked across the cities in the US, and good places to live are small college towns, for instance. They tend to do very well. And it's not necessarily the students, because most of the people you're sampling are not students. But, I'm sitting now in Princeton, New Jersey, which is a small college town, with a population of about 20,000 people. And a lot of people, when they're retired or whatever, come to live here because there's a lot going on here, a lot of intellectual activities, sort of music and things. And people seem to like that. And you see that across the place. In the US, people who live in Hawaii are really happy. They also live longer than anyone else. And maybe you say, okay, palm trees and beaches are really good for you. I don't know. It certainly, makes a certain amount of sense. So place seems to matter. Women are a little happier than men are. Educated people are more happy. Divorced people are very unhappy. So all of these things, and there's a big literature on this. You can go and read the stuff, and they'll give you all the things that do not make people happy. I think people were happy during the Olympics in London, for instance, especially when Britain won more medals than they expected to win.
So given that you said that besides money, there should be a lot more factors for us to be happy. So given that, like in real life, like money is just like bread and butter, right? So let's say you're gonna buy a house, you're gonna like pay your living, you're gonna pay your food, you need money. So does it mean that besides, like only the retired population are more likely to be happier, given that they don't really have to be worried about the money and they don't really have to worry about the living because probably they might be on pension or they got some kind of like money support? So does it kind of bring us to restrict happiness to a certain age group?
I don't think so. I'm not a great fan of that literature, that the older people are always happy. We did a sort of review paper in the Lancet, for instance. And, if you look across African countries, for instance, it's just not true. And also in the US right now, it's not clear how long that pattern is listed for. Our data don't go back very far. In China, the old people tend to be happier, but then that's a society which gives great respect and deference to elderly people. And maybe that is what is doing it. So, but it's true that there are a lot of things like stress. You're all young people. Dating and mating are things that cause people a lot of stress, and there's a lot of potentiality for unhappiness there. You have dates with people who turn out to be a disaster. It makes you really unhappy. But there's no other way of having dates and finding out someone that you might actually like and settle down. One of the nice things about being old is I don't have to do that anymore, And one story is that as you get older, you shed the people you don't like very much. When you're retired, you don't have to work with that jerk that you've been working with for 30 years and you hated every minute of it. And so there's those sort of stories, which I think can certainly lead. There's much less stress in old age. That seems to come through in all these data. You asked something at the very beginning, which I meant to respond to, but I got so excited by what you said at the end, I forgot. What was the first thing you said?
Oh, I think the first thing I was just saying, like, is it just like money is so important in daily life? So does it just sort of restrict us to a certain age group? So it's more like what I said, what we just discussed. And based on that, sorry, I also have a follow-up question. So given that, sorry, I probably forgot to introduce myself. So I'm also a medical student now. So I'm just wondering, like, because like, even though right now, like as a medical student, so what can I prepare myself in order to make my patients to be happier, or just to also integrate this concept to them, like based on your perspective?
Yeah, I was worried someone was going to ask that. And you were going to ask me for sort of practical advice. One of the things that I think doctors are too gung-ho on the money thing, right? So they tend to think, well, medicine's not really important. You ought to get a good job and have money, and that way you'll live a long life. And I'm not together sure that's true. I think medicine is incredibly important. And a lot of what doctors do is give reassurance to people. It's obviously, there's the heroic stuff you do too, like, you cure people who are sick. But a lot of the time, when I go to the doctor, I want to be told, stop worrying about that, will you? And that brings people a lot of reduction in stress and a lot of happiness. And also, I think just a lot of people are scared of doctors. I'm not sure that's true in your society, and it probably seems sort of silly to you right now. But it's important, and I remember when my parents were elderly in Scotland, they had this enormous respect for doctors, which got in the way. They didn't dare ask them questions, for instance. And I think it's much better what we have now, which is that you communicate with your patients in a way that, helps reassure them. And I think reassurance is probably at least as important as all the medical stuff that you do for people.
I just have a follow-up question, if I may, that when we've been talking about suicide and the role of doctors in their happiness part, we neglect a very important part, that is mental health, because doctors play a very avid role in the society, and we could tend to cater the mental health problems as well in the society to talk about it, because as you said in the earlier of this meeting, that how important mental health is for a well-being and for happiness, although money is, but I've seen very rich people tending to mental health problems as well, and hence at the result of the suicide. So just wanted to bring that perspective over here, and if you want to shed light on the mental health perspective as well. Thank you.
It's certainly true that money buys you no exemption from mental health problems. It also doesn't give them either. I don't think that it's true that the rich people have more mental health problems than I think we tend to have less sympathy for them. They say, it's sort of like, who cares about whether celebrities, have minor neuroses of one sort or another. So, I agree with that.
Okay, Faith, let's come to you next, please.
Hi, everyone. I'm Faith. I'm a third-year medical student from Singapore. And I also like to kind of revisit the topic of suicide, because I think in healthcare, we have this model called the illness-wellness continuum, which I really like, because it really shows that it's not just about the absence of illness, but really about pushing people towards the wellness side of the spectrum, which is something that I think is really important, especially for mental health. And I'm just wondering, Professor Deaton, if you could talk a bit about, firstly, what do you think could be something towards the wellness side of the spectrum, rather than if suicide was at the illness side, then what could be at the wellness side? And secondly, also, I think you mentioned just now some things about what could potentially push someone towards one side of the spectrum, for example, the environment that we're in, especially the social environment. And I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about what we could do to perhaps encourage people towards the side of the wellness spectrum.
Okay, I think I may turn that question back to some of you, because I'm curious as to what they say about in your training. I know that in Britain, for instance, doctors complain all the time that they're not being used as doctors, they're being used as social workers, right? So I don't know, so I see some nods around the table. I actually think that's a good thing, right? Or at least it means that patients are coming to you and the doctor is saying, okay, you come in to get your shot, but what you really need is someone to come and clean your house or something. It's not my job to clean your house, but it may be that you can set things up so that doctors have people they can talk to or help who could move it into the sort of social work department. That works incredibly badly in the United States because most people don't have a doctor. It's all privatized medicine. You see different doctors for different things. When I first came to America, it was one of the most frustrating things I could imagine. I didn't know where to go because, I didn't know the difference between a pediatrician and a podiatrist, so I was taking my children to a foot doctor or something, because in Britain, we don't need to know any of those things. You go to a general practitioner who acts as a gatekeeper for other things. But that's a very natural place for the gatekeeper to say, well, look, go and talk to Joe down the corridor there, and he might be able to help you with these transport things or help you with something else. I don't know how many of you have read some of Paul Farmer's books, but, Paul Farmer, who's been a great inspiration to many doctors, he really believed in meeting the patient where they were. So, if the patient didn't show up for their shots, he went after them, and he'd walk out into the hills of Haiti or whatever to try and find out where they were or why they weren't there. And I think doctors like that are not just an inspiration to everybody else, but I'm sure they're very successful doctors too.
Hello, everyone. I'm Soti from Taipei, Taiwan. I'm studying pharmacy. Hello. And my question is, I was wondering if we really need to pursue happiness. And sometimes we fix on the happiness we used to have or other people's have and want to chase the feelings, accomplishments, and glories or something. And I think sometimes we forgot and ignore the good thing in front of us at present. And I want to ask your perspective. Yes.
Well, I mean, I think I'm not quite sure where you're coming from, but I mean, you sound almost like sort of Buddhist or maybe Confucian here, that, the sources of unhappiness are more internal than external circumstances. Is that what you're arguing? I mean, in which case, a lot of doctors, I'm not sure about pharmacists, who would say, what you need to do is go meditate. And, that would make you feel a lot better rather than pursuing happiness in terms of career or thing. I'm not sure it's true that people used to be happier in some ways, and that I'm not sure that's where you were going. But there is this idea that somehow before we moved into the modern world, we were all naturally very happy. And I just don't buy that. And even if it were true, I wouldn't believe it, if you know what I mean. I remember something affected me very deeply was reading a very fine biography, I'm trying to remember her name, of Charles Darwin. And if you read about Charles Darwin losing his children, which is something that happened even to, very well off, very well educated people in the 19th century, the misery and unhappiness that brought. So I just don't believe that people used to be happier in a world in which their children were dying. And that was an everyday occurrence. And there were many other times. I mean, people were dying of other diseases too. And also, if you look at the work that's been done with the Gallup data, for instance, looking across the world, people in Sierra Leone or Togo just don't think their lives are going very well. And people in, Taiwan do much better. Actually, the Taiwanese and places where there are a lot of ethnic Chinese people tend to be a little less happy. And I suspect that there's something, Chinese people don't like to say they're happy because, they think bad things are going to happen if they do that. So there tends to be a little effect there, which is true mostly in Eastern countries.
Yes, please jump in, Clarissa, please.
Oh, hello everyone. I'm Clarissa. I'm a year 1 humanities student. And something that was very interesting that Mr. Deaton, you just mentioned was that in Eastern Asian countries or in East Asian countries, there's this impression that people tend to be less happy. And it was actually linked to one of the questions that I had about how culture might actually shape the way that people experience or pursue happiness, and therefore the overall happiness levels varying from country to country. So if you could just provide your perspective on that.
Yeah, it's a really good question and a really complicated topic to which I don't know the answer. There's one thing that I think is very important is how people express themselves. So it may be that two people are equally happy in some fundamental sense, but when you ask them, one is being trained up never to say they're happy. Right? So, I grew up in a culture in Scotland where if someone says, how are you doing? The best you would ever say is, I mustn't grumble. Right? That's as positive as you can ever get. And in Scotland, people don't like to talk about their emotions. I often say in Scotland, depression is a weather system. It's not anything that goes on inside your head. And in America, where you come to America, people feel they have a duty to be happy. So if you said, how are you doing? Oh, I couldn't possibly be happier. And I'm not sure these are cultural things so much as cultural ways of expressing yourselves. But it could be the second explanation, which you raised, is this some deep ethnic or cultural thing in different countries. And I'm not sure we know the answer to that. There's also these questions that are very are difficult to translate, and there's sort of literature on that. Because happy in English does not mean the same as heureux in French, for instance. And I'm sure enough of you are multinational to be able to come up with examples of that, of your own. Whereas words that seem to mean the same thing actually don't mean the same thing. And so there's all that to contend with. And I think that research is not decisive one way or another. There's a lot of it. There's a guy who died last year, a very distinguished researcher called Ed Diener, and he has written a lot of papers with collaborators, most of whom are called Diener too. I mean, his wife, his kids, and so on. There's this sort of Diener factory of papers, and they've looked at a lot of these cultural things, and the work is very interesting, but I'm not sure it's really decisive.
I wanted to ask you about that, Angus, because coming from the rigor of economics and stepping into this minefield of kind of possibility of happiness research and all the linguistic challenges and all the different ways that people might approach even words that they do think mean the same thing. How have you coped with that kind of lack of precision?
It's a liberation, It's not. I think economics is much fuzzier than people think it is too, and so we like to pretend we're sort of a bench science, measuring everything very precisely. But there's a lot of politics involved. There's a lot of sociology, a lot of psychology involved, and actually, the biggest trouble I had coming into this research is just the sort of tribal things. So that when you work with psychologists, they use the same words to mean very different things, which comes back to just what we were talking about. And often even in statistical procedures, they have very different procedures, and then are very different ways of thinking about things. And so that doesn't affect you if you're working within your literature, because all your referees and your editors know what you're talking about. But if you submit a paper to another field, God save you, these people, you get no protection from that at all. And I think also it's a little hard for me to separate from working with Danny Kahneman, which is, the man is a genius and has incredible insights, and has really changed social science in an extraordinary way across many, many different fields. But in my neck of the woods, when you want to settle an argument, you write down equations. To many of you, that probably seems like a really foreign thing to do. But if it's not clear what's going on, the only way to get a seriously rigorous argument, and I realize that mathematics is not seriously completely rigorous either, is to write down the mathematics, and you know what you agree about and you know what you disagree about. And Danny does not use mathematics. And so that's been a very difficult barrier to cross. So I find that disciplinary things harder than thing. But one of the things, I talked about this in Stockholm, actually, in the speech that you get to give at the end of the banquet, which was that I think economics is much more open to interdisciplinary things now than it used to be. And I think it has to confront its failures. and that many of these failures can be better dealt with by talking to doctors or talking to psychologists or talking to sociologists. I just give you one final example if I'm not going on too long. One of my very best friends, Sarah McClanahan, died just before Christmas last year, and she was a very distinguished sociologist here at Princeton, sociologist who worked on families and on kids and on how kids did when their parents got divorced or issues like that, very close to some of the things we've been talking about. And there's a memorial service for her this coming weekend, and I went back to read an important paper she'd written. And it was a stunning experience because I felt like I could have written this. Now, of course, I couldn't have written it 20 years ago. It's just because we'd have dinner together once a week and it all rubbed off. And so I'd become much broader, understood a whole bunch of issues. And I owe that to her. And I owe that. And that's a very important thing, I think, in universities or perhaps even in medical practices, to get people from different disciplines together who can work together and talk to one another, so you don't get sunk in a disciplinary silo where you only talk to people who are just like you. All right, I'm ranting now and I'll stop.
Hi everyone, and hi Professor Deaton. I'm Hanso and I'm from Singapore, and I'm currently studying as a third-year student in pharmaceutical science, particularly clinical trials. So that's it. I'm definitely not any sort of expert on this topic, but I just want to say that, you know, the pursuit of happiness, it's a really great topic. I'm glad to talk about with such like-minded individuals, and I'm really happy to be here with everyone. So far, it's been really, really insightful hearing everyone speak so well on such large-scale topics. So for me, I think I'm going to touch on more of a smaller scale that hits closer to home for myself. So I hope I can reach everyone on a more personal level. So this type of thing, it gets really deep and philosophical. So I think it's like a number of us, it may or may not be something that we can easily talk about with our friends, but I'm sure we can all agree it's something we value and we think about deeply and frequently. And with each passing day, you know, we discover a lot regarding our own happiness, our morals and principles, and finding happiness to keep ourselves going amidst all like the negativity around us, which could be an endless chase. So I'd like to share my thoughts and, you know, hear others' opinions regarding this. It's not easy sustaining the strength to remain optimistic every single day nonstop, which is why it's important for us to find things in life that give us, you know, that personal joy to keep ourselves going with all the bad stuff happening in the world. With an ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, we're also affected in several ways that it's really, really easy to forget what we have and to be grateful for. So that said, here in Singapore, it's really clear that our so-called natural resource is like our people. Yet we're currently facing a problem where our citizens are no longer wanting to reproduce. In fact, in Singapore, the birth rate has fallen because of an increase in the proportion of highly educated Singaporeans who tend to have fewer children. And with each passing year, the birth rates are declining by approximately 1% with each year in the past few years. So as a youth who's, you know, so absorbed in my own academic career while also trying to make ends meet, it gets really overwhelming. And our education system is pretty well known globally for being successful, yet there's been cases of, you know, young children at the age of 12 years old taking their own life because of the pressure that they're under academically. So these are just some of my thoughts, you know, with my situation and my observation as a Singaporean. So maybe posing this to Professor Deaton, I'd love to hear your thoughts about, you know, this problem of a successful society such that people are so career driven to the extent that we're forgetting to enjoy life, spread positivity, and even repopulate. So it makes myself question how successful we really are, considering how subjective it is.
Boy, there's a lot of really good stuff in there. You know, it takes me back, I think 20 or 30 years ago when I was visiting the National University of Singapore, people were telling stories about the Prime Minister or his immediate deputies calling up students or asking the head of the Department of Economics to make sure that his students had girlfriends or boyfriends. And, you know, you weren't supposed to, just in order to address this question, they were worried about falling fertility rates even then. I don't know that much about fertility rates, but it's a really, really big question because, you know, many thinkers believe that falling fertility rates are a really bad sign. And it's a sign that a society might have lost its way to some extent. You know, if you don't want to reproduce, if you don't want to have more people like you in the future, then there's something wrong. Against that, you know, there's this long literature in economic development and elsewhere that talks about what you were talking about, which is that educated women are one of the great benefits of educating women around the world, is to give them autonomy and allow them to pursue what they really want to pursue, whether it's having children or not. And that higher educated women around the world have lower fertility. And that's always seemed like a good thing, you know, that women in many of the poorest countries of the world become just breeding animals sort of idea and have very little control or fertility all over their lives. And freeing them up from that, in part because of falling in for mortality, they don't have to have 10 children because they're not going to die anymore. All of that seems really good thing. So, you know, people like me have been brought up to think that falling fertility is a good thing. But when you get to the levels that you're talking about, it seems like a very different question. Of course, the other places where fertility was incredibly low was in the Eastern European countries in the Soviet orbit and in the old days, and that also seemed like a very bad sign. So I don't think, you know, if you talk to philosophers, the issue of population ethics is really, really hard, and there's no agreement there about it at all. Whether more people are good, whether fewer people are good, but richer people, those are very deep questions we don't know the answer to. But I'm very sympathetic to, you know, and Lee Kuan Yew always knew the answer to any problem he would ever throw at him. You know, he and I went to the same college in Cambridge, and was one of its honorary fellows, as am I. But I'm not sure pressuring students to reproduce is really a very good thing either. So I'm very sympathetic to your question, but I don't know the answer to it. If we get time, a couple of you have said you're training to be pharmacists, right? And so maybe I can ask you a question, which is, you know, one of the things in the happiness literature is one route to happiness is just to take drugs, right? What's it called in Brave New World? I think it's called Soma or something, right? So everybody is fed this drug and is kept on this happiness machine in which they just feel incredibly contented all the time, but they're basically like a big vegetable in a jar or something, but they're really, really happy. Okay, so I presume they don't train you in pharma school in how to administer that particular drug. But it does seem like an interesting issue, and I think in some ways it's quite decisive for people who say you should just pursue happiness, because if you just want to pursue happiness, why not hook yourself up to get yourself a good anesthesiologist and get some nice drugs, and you'll be happy for the rest of your life.
Clarissa, did you want to come in on that? Did you?
Yeah, I guess that sort of goes back to the earlier discussion, like right at the beginning of the dialogue that we had about the difference between, I guess, like this kind of physical, hedonistic kind of happiness and like a long-term sense of well-being and a sense of, I guess, meaning that every human sort of is instinctually attuned to this like nebulous concept of happiness. I think that's sort of different from like the basic like kind of physical pleasure that you may get from I don't know, like eating good food or being prescribed a drug that may suppress pain. So I guess in that sense, yeah, in my sense, or from my point of view, I guess there's no kind of drug that will give you that kind of true or long-term sense of well-being or happiness, like finding a passion or being with loved ones or identifying with a community can give a person, yeah, in my opinion.
No, I think that's exactly right. On the other hand, those fuller lives come with pain. And, if you live your life fully and live your life well, that life is going to have a lot of pain in it, a lot of unhappiness, as well as happiness. And so, it's easy to talk about, not easy, but it's much more attractive to talk about living that full life when it's going well than when it really is not. But I'm with you. I mean, I think that's the way that we want to live our lives, and that living our lives as a vegetable in a pharma tank is not a really very good idea. Rainbow.
Yeah, I was just saying they also correlate to a lot of concepts that we just mentioned. So apparently there are a lot of drugs that can bring us happiness, right? Those recreational ones. But I think the main reason we've been saying is more like we have to look for the thing that can really bring you really physical happiness. And I think it's also comes back to the cultural concepts, because I'm actually from an Asian country, but I'm currently studying in Australia. So I can really tell the cultural difference. So because I'm also a Chinese, we Chinese were taught not to show our emotions and then not to express our happiness. But in here, Australia, it is a good thing to show your joy, and then to also be happy to everyone. So I can really tell the cultural difference. And I think sometimes because I'm also a student here, so I'm actually learning as well. So besides learning academic knowledge, I'm also learning a bit of cultural things. So I think this can also be one thing that we as a future doctor or pharmacist or whatever we are, we can apply to our future career as well. Yeah.
Oh, I agree with that. One other issue that maybe I could throw out there. If you go back to this 18th century stuff, the pursuit of happiness, and the fact that that was an Enlightenment context, right? So, what were these people in the 18th century thinking about? Well, what the Enlightenment did was bring freedom to people from the church and from the king, right? So you no longer had to sort of just do what you were told by the church on the one hand and the monarchy on the other. And you could seek out a life for yourself. You could find prosperity for yourself in your own way and using your own reason, your own thought as a way to get there. And I think, maybe the pursuit of happiness was closer to the pursuit of prosperity or something like that when those people wrote it, but it meant in your own way, not being told to by King George or not being told to by the Archbishop of Canterbury or the Pope. And so, this separation, no kings, no established religion, is, you can almost think of that pursuit of happiness as, get on with your life in your own way and make money. I mean, I think a lot of it was actually just, get rich, and so on. So I think it may be a mistake to connect it too closely to what we currently identify as happiness, whether it's solar-related happiness or just. But I think the idea of this broad life that we've been talking about is, I think, a better approximation for that, rather than just thinking about happiness per se.
It's been so fascinating to listen to everybody's comments. We're drawing to the end of our time, but just to finish, on next Tuesday in Singapore, the discussions will be considering these various areas of well-being under the broad title of the future we want together. And some of them will be things like economic well-being or educational well-being, climate change, digital health. All of those, you can see that, you can almost make prescriptions for what we need to do now in order to fix things for climate change or whatever, or for education. There might be different views of what should be done, but we can see that people, it's a kind of call to arms. When it comes to happiness, it's harder to see that. And I just wanted to ask anybody to make a comment, but certainly Angus to make a comment about, if there is some call to arms around happiness, given the comments you made at the beginning, is there something that people should be doing, or is it not that sort of field?
So Maha has an answer. Go for it, Maha.
I actually had the same question in a very rephrased way, that what is the idea of ideal happiness, that what Adam said. So that was just a question directed at the end of this conversation. Like, we've been talking about different concepts, but with your extensive literature, what would be the idea of ideal happiness for every person that is there?
Can I jump in for a second?
Please, please.
I will say that I'm just guessing, but I would say more like to try to look for your own happiness so that you can pursue your own happiness. So let's say maybe like Professor didn't correct me if I'm wrong, like perhaps like while you're chasing, like while you're doing all of this research, like you might be pursuing your own happiness. Like same as us, like we might be finding our own happiness while we're studying our own like discipline that we like. Let's say like me, I'm studying medicine because probably I want to be a psychiatrist because a psychiatrist is what I like. So probably we will probably find our own favorite thing, and that's how we found our happiness, I guess. But yeah, Professor Deaton, if you want to comment.
Well, I mean, in some sense, I shouldn't be commenting because you just said it. You know, you should be pursuing it in your own way. And I would go back to what I said at the very beginning, you know, when I was just giving a little outline at the beginning, which is it's not just money, right? And, you know, when Adam talked about what you're going to do in Singapore next week, you know, that could encapsulate all these other things that you're talking about. You know, if you focus just on money, you don't have much of a good chance of climate change, for example. You know, if you focus just on GDP, which is sort of money writ large, you're not really thinking about people. You're just thinking about heaps of national money. And I think that's a good framework. So for me, what studying happiness and thinking about it has helped me do is to become a better social scientist in a very broad way, and to think about things other than just money. Now, of course, if I were a cynical economist, I could say, all right, Deaton, you have made lots of money now. You're old. You don't need any more money. It's easy for you to say, don't worry about it anymore. You've done that bit, and you can pursue all these nice things. Like when I'm done here, I'm going to go meditate. Actually, I'm not, but there you are. And also skepticism is always very good. We don't talk about skepticism. Claude.
Yes, actually, I wanted to comment to that great question as well. As Professor Deaton is sharing, so we have to pursue something. And I think my definition of happiness is actually having that purpose, looking for that purpose in life. Because there's a literature that I read that actually the opposite of happiness is not sadness, but the lack of hope, which I think could also be one possible reason why we have these issues in mental health and suicides. So maybe having that purpose, I think that's my own definition of happiness per se, or pursuit of happiness. And just also to maybe since we've been asking Professor about economic perspective, maybe a personal question would be, you mentioned earlier about social interactions and also talking to other people in the other disciplines. So I do believe that everyone has their own influence. Maybe if you would give an advice, where could we possibly, in what area could we possibly best invest our influence in order to, you know, in our pursuit of happiness? Maybe Professor Deaton, if you have a personal advice to the young people in the room.
We have to finish in 1 second. So let me just get Clarissa's comment first, and then Angus, I'm going to give the last word to you, and then we're going to close.
Oh, just very quickly, in terms of the call to action on how we can actually practically try to achieve a pursuit of happiness, something that I realized was actually that was in common with the 18th century sort of interpretation of the phrase the pursuit of happiness is this access to self-determination, to And also what other people also mentioned earlier, that being able to pursue a definition of happiness or a future that you personally feel would fulfill you spiritually or just as a human being in general is the ability to determine yourself and your identity and to identify with communities around you as well to prevent alienation, that I feel is sort of a common thread that I've observed in creating happiness for people. So first of all, individual self-fulfillment, self-actualization, and having the infrastructure and the resources to do so. And also secondly, having strong social structures or institutions and communities that can give people a sense of belonging and strengthen their sense of identity, that can really help people from falling into despair and isolation and high suicide rates like we discussed earlier. So in terms of practical considerations, I realized these things through our discussion. So yeah.
I think that's right. I don't want to extend the time, but I do have one final thing in response to what to do. I have a friend who's a minister, a priest, and I was talking to him one day, and he was pretty unhappy. One of his kids was having a hard time, and that's a real recipe for unhappiness. And he said, his wife looked at him, and he said, and she gave him what seemed really good advice. She said, stop sitting there looking miserable. Go out and help someone. That's it. And I think that works.
We've ended with a call to action. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. This was just fantastic. It's such a pleasure to meet you. I'm so sorry I won't be in Singapore. I loved being in Singapore. I remember it being incredibly hot, but now America's even hotter than Singapore. So thank you all. It's been a huge pleasure. Thank you.